And the first thing we're going to talk about is Jabil. Jabil rhymes with enable. So how many of you, I did this yesterday, how many of you have heard of it now that you've been here? Okay, could somebody get a picture of that and tweet it, and I'm paid for. So basically, I just want to start by saying there's been a lot of really interesting things said, and I don't want to repeat them. I do have a presentation, which is there, beginning there. But I'm assuming that this is a conference that was made for people who know how to read, so I won't be saying what's on the slides. I think what's interesting is, if you don't know how to read, you should probably leave now. I think if I wanted to start IoT, I mean, I tend to call it something else in my head. I call it ubiquitous sensors, ubiquitous platforms. Use up, which I like better because it's really what it's about. It's not about things, as we've heard. It's about the body. It's about people. It's about theater. It's about a lot of things. But basically what it is access to the infrastructure for every individual, but also access from the infrastructure to every individual, right? That's what we're really talking about. And if you wanted to leverage that amazing, what I said yesterday, Uberization of the world, what would you do? I mean, let me just ask you guys, what would you do? What's the first thing you would think of in your practice? What would you do? You want to leverage that. What do you do? What kind of coffee are you serving here? What would you do?
Chip everybody.
You do what?
Chip everybody.
Chip everybody. Okay, well, that's one approach. Over here, what would you do? You wouldn't do anything. You just watch it happen. And, you know, yeah, groove on the rubble. What would you do? If you want to leverage all that infrastructure, what would you do if you had the power?
The infrastructure.
Well, the whole thing. I mean, you know, the sensors, the infrastructure. Big. You think, oh, I've got a problem now. Sorry, I screwed up your great work there. I'll manage it. Hold on. Excuse me. There we go. So back there, what would you do? Everything, yeah, you do everything. You do total control. What would you do over here?
I'll index the real world.
You'd index the real world because you're Planet OS, right? What would you do?
Create a decentralized system which allows devices to connect.
Decentralized system that allows devices to connect. We talked a little bit about that in standards yesterday. Like, we've been working on this kind of concentric PAN, LAN, out to WAN, right? And now we're going to work on a different thing. What I was trying to get at is everybody has their own approach to how to leverage these resources. One thing I was expecting to hear that I didn't hear was projects, pilots, right? Specific, concrete projects that we saw yesterday and this morning. And that's what Jabil is trying to enable, right? Basically, we know what's about to happen, right? This is going to be what iOS was to the mobile phone world, right? I remember speaking to, I do a lot of innovation coaching at board levels, and I was talking to a very, very big telecoms operator that is based on a color and a fruit. I can't name the name, and this was like 8 years ago, and I was saying, guys, this is not going to be 5% of the market. Every dumb person in the world is going to have a smartphone, right? And we started looking at applications that would go with that. Nobody believed that there would be the ramp that we predicted in our little team in France, but the ramp was even higher than we predicted, right? So one of the things is they're not ready for it. We're just in MWC, a lot of us. The telcos are saying they're not ready for it, and they also don't have the business models for it. But so what you have to do to get going on this is you have to do projects. And the use cases are just over the top now. So everybody is getting into this, and this Uber approach to the interface between us and the infrastructure and the sensors is about to take another whole step with people like Sigfox. How many of you have heard of Sigfox? All right, tell me what's Sigfox.
It's ultra-narrowband communications, so you can send very small amounts of data.
Yeah, it's microchipping data, basically, right? And what it allows you to do is, for infinitesimal cost, put a chip on every living person, thing, reptile. I think you could probably go halfway through the insects as well. And this means something. It means that you got to deal with the infrastructure load that implies. The other thing is that the standards, we don't have them. We don't have any standards. We don't have any protocols. I talked yesterday about this issue of leisure versus seizure, which I'll get to in a moment. And the manufacturers, therefore, are looking for things to pilot. And that's the reason I'm here. I'm actually not a corporate guy. In fact, just for the record, I made $1 billion mistake in our revenue. Marco probably noticed it. It's $18 billion in revenue, Jabil. 24 countries, 6 major divisions that go from medical to aerospace and defense. And the division that I work with directly is called High Velocity or Emerging Tech. And what we're trying to do is pick the winners of the future. Now, Jabil has made many of the products that have broken through, and so some of our competitors have done the same thing, but we're involved with 40% of the world's action cameras. I can't mention a brand, but it was mentioned earlier. We're involved with about 30% of every piece of electronics you wear. 45% of all of the smartphone cameras are made by Jabil, right? So this is a company that's looking for projects. Why? Because the appetite for these things, smart, dumb, QRC, whatever it is growing. People are getting educated. I don't know if you, David, you ran into D-Tech at MWC, the guys from Botswana who are making the African smartphone.
I read about it.
Amazing. These guys are bootstrapping, using the same type of approach as Blocks and the other guys. An African company in Botswana making very credible, easy, $45 and under smartphones, right? This is going to change the world. And so the story that we're going through now, I was just saying, I started, this whole thing for me started in the 90s when we started putting RFID chips on beer barrels, actually. Project for SAB. We increased their throughput of their beer barrels. I don't know if we contributed to the end of apartheid this way, but I hope so. We put chips on beer barrels that increased the throughput by about 80% in terms of the efficiencies of running beer kegs in and out of their factories. Then we did it with everything that was heavy, and then we tried to do it with cars. So we tried to do the first connected car in 1999, a bunch of my engineer buddies and I. So it's going to make, then I got into media, digital media, and streaming went through the same thing we're going through now with data, right? Streaming was first a hard thing to do. You had to hire engineers, you had to write codecs. We did the first streaming out of Davos, right? We had 8 guys in a bunker in Davos managing the codecs. Now that's, we had Akamai as a partner to make it secure. Now that's all banal, right? And that's the same thing we're going to go through now, same curve. So what you need to do is we know the stakes, we've been through this, everybody's been through this. But I think the thing that hit me the most coming from MWC in Barcelona was the telco operators are not ready, right? They have the infrastructure, but they have no idea of how the business model is going to change. And it was very funny, we were talking to a guy who was at Zuck's thing when Zuckerberg comes, it's the only conference he does is the MWC. And I was talking with a friend of mine who's on the board of the GSMA, used to run a major mobile carrier. And I said, it's funny that Zuckerberg comes here. And he says he comes here because they effed up mobile so bad in Facebook, and they don't have a real relationship with the operators. So he's got to come and say, carry my stuff. Well, what's that going to be when it's multiplied by 100, 1,000, 1,000,000? So I think the market needs now to bring partners together and to form coalitions around specific projects. And that's one of the things Jabil is doing. We've created a center for IoT and wearables in San Jose that's going to open in about 60 days. And this center is going to go all over the world. And in fact, I'm the guy responsible for this part of the world, if you will. In fact, I've done a lot of this stuff in countries from here to, say, Kazakhstan for them. And we're looking at every company that could have a contribution to make to various projects that we're associated with, get them to join with us and do this, and we're going to be investing in this. And you can see here the different issues that we're trying to deal with. One of the biggest one is user education. So we heard, beacon technology, that's great, but how do you use it actually? Same thing happened to QRC codes. I remember helping a company in France. They got AT&T to build them a $15 million data center, but nobody knew how to get the consumer to use the codes, right? The layers of interaction, I'm not going to go through this because it's been gone through a great deal, but I will just focus on one thing, which is the orchestration, the part of orchestration. This was stolen from SDI, by the way. Orchestration, that is, you've got to have the hardware the user offer, the spectrum, and the business model together. You can't be, I did some great hardware, and then find out that actually it doesn't interface with anything. And you can't be, I've got a great business model if I can just get the consumer to sign up. Because if it doesn't pay everybody in the circuit, this is a very holistic ecosystem, right? And I think that's one of the areas we'll be focusing on. Cases, I won't go over this because it's basically what we've heard over the last couple of days. But I will touch on one thing, transport and emergency services. We all remember this disastrous thing that happened in the London ambulance service when they got their technology wrong a few years ago, right? They actually had to close the service for a couple of days. You know, they were taking calls, right? And I know a company here in the UK that I worked with that did a lot of AVL, automatic vehicle location, right? AVL is a big deal for transport. It's a big deal for cities. It's a big deal for parking, all of those things. One of the things that happened with these guys is they went for a hardware solution. They said, we're going to put a tablet in every bus, right? And we're going to locate that tablet, and we're going to be really clever. Well, just a year later, I invested in a company in San Francisco at Berkeley called VIA Analytics, I mentioned yesterday. And VIA made an open source product that does that for free, right? And they even give the data about transport operations for free to the municipality. So they can get into the buses on any tablet or phone that's, you know, that has a SIM card and offer the services that they offer. So the lightness and the elimination of CapEx is going to change the whole implementation schedule, right? So it's going to be very fast. First things first, I mean to say, let's do projects where we change for the better our world, right? So the first one is obvious, right? Parking. How much CO2 do you think is made by people trying to park in a city, average city? How much of the CO2 output of cars? Let's make it more specific. A number, any number. You guys lost the gift of speech? What?
25%.
Well, we'll have a discussion about nobody can say where it comes from. That's pretty interesting. It was measured pretty closely, apparently, by the guys that made this parking software we're working with in San Francisco, based on a kind of green dots approach to watching cars' behaviors with about 1,000 cars over a period of 3 months. And then they extrapolated that. So yeah, that's the one figure we have is 35%. But it's also millions of hours of time, our time, productive time, right? So first things first, and make it look easy. I think what Waze did was so great because they made the problem a community effort, right? Everybody's solving each other's problems. And I think that's another place where we're going to concentrate in the kinds of companies we work with. I've talked about this a number of times, but I just want to point out one thing. This is the way we see the world now. It's very concentric. It's me, then something, then them, then the world, right? But in fact, what we want to see is intersections, horizontality here. So what I call the social area network or the city area network, this is the way we've got to start thinking. Instead of silos, the cloud allows us to think in other ways. So I could have a device, and I could just have a toggle. I'm in the world, I'm out of the world. One of the interesting things that's going to happen is the identity, ID. So yeah, got it, 2 minutes. I'm on the 2-minute warning. It's good because I'm about 2 minutes away. So the other thing that's going to happen is identity. So privacy, I think, is going to be resolved by Identity 3.0. So where am I, in which world am I, and how am I ring-fenced? I have my closed garden, and then I can go walk into the open garden. Leisure versus seizure, I've talked about that a number of times. It's about, this is just one point I'll make again, because I think it's so important, is the way we manage net neutrality going forward is going to condition the success or failure of what we're calling ubiquitous sensors, ubiquitous platform, right? That leisure, when I'm running and I have my 160 heartbeat, that's okay because we know who I am and I have an accelerometer so they can see that I'm running. If I'm a 75-year-old sitting down at a bus stop, they know that the guy's having a heart attack. He's not running, right? So which signal gets priority on the network and how is it managed is going to be a big deal. And so pilot projects, we're working now with IoT for cities as a project in Jabil, and the San Francisco government has now signed an accord with us, a little accelerator called Wearable World, which works out of San Francisco and which is going to start, has done a few things here too with some help from us. And then we also are working with New Orleans, where VIA Analytics is involved in the transport, for example, privacy has been talked about enough. I just want to recommend CB Insights for a lot of IoT data in terms of what's going on in the marketplace. I think they have the most intuitive and best data. This is just a shout out to Topher White, who I think this is a great example of how this all can work beautifully. This is a kid in the US who said, well, you know, if the rainforests are an issue for CO2, every tree we save is a big deal, right? So what he did was he went and he said, I'm going to collect all the 150 million phones that are thrown away every year. I'm going to gut them. I'm going to make them into sensors and stick them on trees. And they're going to tell me when a chainsaw is working within a kilometer of that tree. And then I'm going to compare that automatically with a database of logging permits. And then I'm going to fly a fucking helicopter in there and get the guy, right? So that's the way they're going to save the rainforest, right? And you can use drones, right? Now you can use drones. You don't even need the helicopter. So this is a really nice project, and I just wanted to shout out. It's called Rainforest Connection Cloud. It's a cloud API app with, for the moment, bootstrapped old phones are being used for it, but you know, soon we'll be making them, I hope, we'll be making them something else. Now, just to prove the mobile smartphone transition is not really a good model, because this is going to be many, many more nodes growing at faster and faster speeds. So there's got to be concentration now on putting teams together to do that. To prove I'm not a corporate guy, I'm actually from the venture world, and I work with Jabil from the outside in. I do a thing with them called excubation. Yeah? I put up 17 instead of $18 billion. But it does help to have that balance sheet, because you can do things like we've done, like create the center of excellence. And that's what we want to emphasize here. I won't go through this stuff. This is basically the program for IoT for Cities. Talk to me about it, because we're at the end. That's it. I went a bit over. I'm sorry about that.
Thank you very much, Josh. San is already taken, I'm afraid. Storage area networks, pretty well entrenched.
I know,
in
that doesn't bother me. Still works as a concept.
Fair enough. You know? Good. Just an observation. You were talking about Zuckerberg, for example, at Mobile World Congress, and it's his second year there now. This year, people really didn't like what he had to say, i.e. nothing. Yeah. And there were journalists queuing up for 2 hours to get in, and then he didn't have anything to say. But you were saying about Facebook having stuffed up mobile, and Facebook now kind of going back almost cap in hand to mobile operators. I disagree with that, because...
Oh, by the way, I was quoting someone else. Right?
OK, good. Well, I disagree with that person you were quoting, simply because Facebook is instrumental, as are a lot of other, brands up there with the next billion users, but making that happen themselves, taking control away from the traditional networks, by launching balloons and launching drones and stuff to bring internet connectivity. Now, which then leads on to where innovation hits that, because if brands are looking at the next billion users, they're not looking at high-end, they're not looking at pushing the technological boundaries there, they're looking at low-range smartphones. $45 smartphone in Botswana, for example. The mid-range smartphones equipping developing worlds. That there doesn't spell to me that we're going to be seeing all that much more innovation here in terms of the high-end, in terms of pushing those technology boundaries. It's going to be more infrastructural stuff. It's going to be more... making sure that we do have, internet connectivity.
You mean in terms of hardware?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think you're looking at the next 5 years, right?
I think a lot of what we're seeing now as apps is going to be chipified, basically, because that's the progress. That's what you see happening. Plus, it's the best way to protect your IP when you're a software developer. So I see my friend at FlexCon is nodding his head. So I must be smart, because he's been in this business for a lot longer than I have. But I think just to comment on the coverage issues and the emerging world. One of my pet projects is a company called Balloon in Barcelona, which is launching balloons into space to launch microsatellites to do coverage in Africa. Yep. And what we think is that they're going to skip a generation in the emerging world, just the way they did with banking, with M-Pesa, right? Yep. They're going to go right to the connected platform. And they're not going to have, and their cities need it, and they're not going to have this waiting period that we're having. That's why I think it's another exponential piece of the puzzle.
That's going to be quite an interesting area, isn't it? Anyway, good stuff. For now, Josh, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks a lot.
Josh from Jabil, ladies and gentlemen.